Our next speaker is really world-renowned. He has just published a new book, which I think is going to be a bestseller, Twilight in the Desert. He has now relinquished one of his positions in his company so that he has more time to do what he's doing today and to help educate the American people. Matt Simmons.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. It's been interesting in the last 6 months I've had some unbelievably interesting educational experiences as a result of coming out with this book and participating in, I guess this summer, 110 radio talk shows around North America. And I got to tell you that people hearing bad news, truthfully, are willing to take bad news. And it's been really remarkable. I've also had a really interesting experience getting acquainted with Congressman Bartlett and seeing how amazing it is that someone can pick so quickly up on these facts. I happen also to be slowly but surely co-authoring an edit-out piece with another congressman. He's been long retired, Stuart Udall. 50 years ago, Stuart Udall was sworn in as a congressman of the United States, and then during the 60s, he was Secretary of the Interior in the Kennedy and Johnson administration. And our co-authored, if I can ever finish up my second draft and send it back to Stuart Udall, is 50 years of energy mistakes. As he can go back with the benefit of hindsight and actually discuss 50 years, 25 sessions of Congress, how we made one mistake after another. So this is basically a big problem. It was also interesting last Tuesday morning, I was at the in London at the Oil and Money Conference, which is probably the most important global sort of conference held once a year where all of the sort of senior OPEC people are there and all of the a lot of the CEOs of major oil companies. And on the first panel of the morning, there were three of us, a lawyer, and then I was the first speaker, and the third speaker was Dr. Sadat al-Husseini, who is retired executive vice president of Saudi Aramco in charge of oil and gas. I think the audience thought that they were going to set us, going to witness a literal verbal battle because my views on the worry about Saudi Arabia's oil are now very public, and Dr. al-Husseini, who's a PhD from Brown, was known as the brains of Saudi Aramco until he retired a year and a half ago. I surprised the audience by not really getting at all into Middle East oil. I basically said we're all consumed now with the fact that we've run out of refinery capacity. What's even more profound is we've run out of drilling capacity. We're out of drilling rigs. We're just totally out of drilling rigs, and it'll take longer to actually restore capacity in drilling rigs than refineries. And then Dr. al-Husseini got up and, in being very politically correct, because he wants to still live in Saudi Arabia, gave a very powerful message through a lot of different slides. He effectively said that the Middle East has a productive capacity today of 21 to 23 million barrels a day, somewhere in that range, and best case is by 2025 it will be 25 million barrels a day. Best case. And he showed basically the decline of Iran, and he showed the Bergen field and what would happen if it increased and then collapsed. He stayed totally away from his own country, but he was speaking to his countrymen. And so it was a pretty astonishing speech. What I was asked to address today is the topic of today's energy reality. And in my opinion, it's a pretty simple story. We are in a deep hole. One of the interesting comments that I heard from an energy economist about 4 years ago was he said, if you wake up one morning and you find out that you're in a deep hole, rule number one is stop digging. Well, our wake-up call is here, because America and the world drifted into a benign energy war. How we drifted there was that demand was supposed to peak. I think it's so interesting. If you go back a decade ago and Google the word peak, it was all demand is about to peak. It wasn't supply. Supplies basically were supposed to grow and grow cheaply. Energy economists told other economists that didn't know anything about energy, that told everyone else, and they said that one thing that's going to happen is technology is going to basically continually bring down the cost of extracting oil and gas, make it cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. That belief was so deeply embedded that by 1999, when oil prices had suffered their biggest collapse in 50 years on a perceived oil glut that never showed up, just bad data, the best minds in the oil industry said, no, $10 oil won't last. It's going to go to $5 and stay there for almost a decade because Saudi Arabia is going to flood the world with oil. And that became so believed that it became the cover story of The Economist. And then 9 months later, in their Millennium issue, they published one of the funniest stories I've ever heard. We was wrong. Called it the biggest blooper of the 20th century. Well, these were all great theses, but they were simply dreams. And now the alarm clock is ringing to wake up. These were just simply dreams. It turned out that everything went awry. Demand didn't peak. It grew too fast. 1995, 10 years ago, demand finally exceeded 70 million barrels a day. But it took almost the entire year before people said, my gosh, demand is surprisingly growing again. And then, over the next 10 years, every time it grew, it was deemed to be an aberration. And the best guesses for the fall, for the fourth quarter and the first quarter of the period we're coming into, is that global energy demand, oil demand, is apparently going to be between 87 and 88 million barrels a day. That will be somewhere between 2 and 5 million barrels a day more than we can supply. And then in this era that costs were going to come down through technology, turned out a funny thing happened there. The cost to drill and complete an average well doubled. And we did find a lot of new supply over this period of time. It's just that they were all little things. I mean, Shell Oil Company now is talking about their exploration goal of finding some big cats. It was only a decade ago that the lingo was, we're going after elephants. And it turns out that all this technology we were talking about, it was sort of also illusory because we couldn't afford, because of low prices, to drill adequate appraisal wells and core the wells so we knew what was there. So we used the concept that 3D seismic, which has never ever shown anything about anything but the possible structure, actually created reserves that weren't even there. And so we systemically overstated our proven reserves. And then energy reserves that we had quite a bit of 10 or 15 years ago in this efficient free market were perceived to be glut. And so we used them up. And the mantra of we're really getting efficient and just-in-time supply has arrived on the energy patch. And by August 2005, our spare capacity was disappearing. It was disappearing at the wellhead. It was disappearing in our system of pipeline and tankage to process oil and natural gas so that it would become usable. It was disappearing in drilling rigs. It was disappearing in refineries. It was disappearing in people. People. We spent 20 years laying off about 4 times more people than we hired, while the industry got more people intensive. And projects. There were no more projects to do either. We were effectively at 100%. We were at 100% capacity as we drifted into the end of August. And ironically, I spent the summer talking a lot about the fact that this sort of smells to me like the summer of 1939. When the summer of 1939, all of Europe was still in a daydream that we'll never have another war. And if you read the papers in the last week of August 1939, they were still daydreaming, we'll never have another war. And then on the 2nd of September, we found out that we were already in the middle of World War II. It had started a couple of years ago. Well, in my opinion, Katrina was our energy 9/11. And ironically, it happened on the 29th of August. What Katrina took away was more capacity than we had left, in a nutshell. The full impact of Katrina is just barely beginning to be assessed. About the day before we had to evacuate the Gulf of Mexico again, they were just starting to actually do any inspection below the waterline. So all of this stuff, it didn't look like there was much damage, was also a dream. It might be that it didn't do much damage. The time frame to rebuild is very hazy. All of these comments that, well, this system is probably going to be out for 2 to 3 weeks, is basically just in the estimate that if we had everybody ready to go today and we knew what we should do and we were on a fast track, it would take 2 to 3 weeks. Natural gas got hit far worse than oil. And a local emergency from the Gulf will spin into a global issue. If any of you didn't have a chance this morning to look at USA Today, there's a very interesting on page 4B showing the path of Rita. And what Rita did was finally sweep right over, while it was Force 5, the heart and soul of the platforms and pipelines of the Gulf of Mexico. And I think it will probably be Thursday or Friday before we have any sort of reports of the visual, how many platforms we don't have and what's happened to rigs. But it couldn't be good news. Now, so the question really becomes, how did we dig ourselves into such a deep hole? Well, it was basically 2 decades of poor data. We had an energy data system that wasn't ever very good, and it got worse. It was basically then 2 decades of terrible analysis of bad data. It was basically the fact that all of our energy experts were basically the generals fighting the last war. These experts were still smarting over the fact that they got shrill in 1980 and 81 and predicted we were going to have $100 oil just as oil prices collapsed, as we had 4 years respite of demand growth as nuclear power came on. And they said, man alive, I've learned my lesson. Don't ever trust demand. And I'll tell you one thing, every time oil is high, we'll create a glut. It's just like clockwork. And low prices created by bad analysis and a perception that we had a glut created the wrong signals. Everyone's always saying prices are good signals. Well, we got actually the wrong signals from low prices. The low price signals said we'll always have low prices. And then it turns out that strong opinions, really strong opinions, by people who call themselves experts, overruled facts. At this Oil and Money conference last Wednesday morning, one of my favorite people in the energy business, Herman Franzen, who used to be chief economist of the IEA and is really respected among his peer group of chief economists, said to his profession, he said, I think basically, gentlemen, it's time to stop using the word I believe outside of church. Well, what's our next step? Rule number 1 is stop digging. Rule number 2 is reform energy data. We urgently need a global mandated field-by-field production report on a quarterly basis, accompanied by the number of wellheads that field is producing, so for the first time ever, analysts can do serious supply analysis. Rule number 3 is let's go to an energy war footing, just like we were forced to go to a war footing after Poland was invaded. And when we went to that war footing in 5.5 years from scratch, we created a war machine that was so powerful that we destroyed Europe and Japan. We can create a war machine and lick the energy war if we start today. We also basically have another role model. In June 1947, we began the Marshall Plan. And in 5 years, the Marshall Plan, 2,500 people, actually fanned out around Europe and created the blueprint and the foundation for rebuilding Europe. So it can be done, but not if we sit around. I basically believe there is a Plan B that works. But it's going to work by basically addressing in the oil front, transportation energy has to be reduced. We have to move goods by trains and boats. Turns out the SUV isn't the problem. It's large trucks moving goods thousands of miles, getting 3 to 5 miles per gallon and clogging up our highways. Movement of people. We don't need 5,000 people to work in the same building on the mantra we need to communicate, and yet an exit poll shows only 2% know each other. We have the technology today to work at home or in your village and keep your same job and be more efficient. We need to distribute food where we grow it, kind of victory gardens. Look at Whole Foods as a model. And they create a stringer of organic gardens within about a 30-mile radius of all their stores, and their food is good. Natural gas problems, unfortunately, are really far more difficult to figure out how we fix. In fact, I don't know how we fix our natural gas problems. One thing we do is we stop using natural gas to create electricity, where we use up too much of it while we're creating electricity. And then R&D has to explode. For the first time in 100 years, we need to get serious about inventing some new forms of energy. Well, can the job get done? It has to. And ingenuity is not is the byproduct of panic. And I think what Katrina and Rita did, we will soon find out, was basically create panic. And I think probably, unfortunately, that was good news, because we needed a wake-up call. The alternatives are too bad. And the longer we wait, the deeper the hole it becomes. So stop digging. And when should we start Plan B? I actually say today would be a great time to start Plan B. Thank you.